This morning, we want to explore a subject that God has brought to my heart for this morning. What does it mean to pick up our cross? What does it mean to count the cost of following Jesus? And for the next few moments, I would like us to consider these questions. Just 2 weeks ago, the last time we met together, thanks to the snow we got last week, Pam and I submitted our resignations as assistant pastors of Parkway. And it has been a heart-rending decision, and it still tugs on our heart. And yet, it's not the first time we've made that decision. It's not the second time we've made that decision. It's not the third time that we've had to make such a decision that would impact our life in a big way. It's not the first time that we had to count the cost of following Jesus. As we begin today, I'd like to share a little bit about my testimony. Most of you haven't heard my testimony, so I'm going to share it with you this morning as we talk about counting the cost. I grew up, matter of fact, by probably the second week I was born, I was in church. I was in my mom and dad's arms, and I grew up in a little church called Orfield Pilgrim Holiness Church, just outside of Allentown. Matter of fact, Bob, who is sitting on the back row, and I grew up there. We grew up at Orfield, and I remember going to this little church. I think there were 8 pews, if I'm not mistaken, on either side. Congregation about 20, 25. And we were at church all the time. My mom and dad, we talk about drug problems. My mom and dad drug me to church constantly. We were there for Sunday school at 9:30, worship at 10:30. Then there was youth meeting at 6 o'clock on Sunday night. Then the regular service on Sunday night at 7 o'clock. We had Wednesday night prayer meeting. And on Tuesday nights during the school year, probably some of you, how do you remember all this? I do. On Tuesday nights during the school year, we had something called CYC. How many remember CYC? Yep. So we had all that. And then there was not 1 week during the summer of Vacation Bible School, but 2 weeks of Vacation Bible School. There was spring revival meeting and fall revival meeting. And if those weren't enough at our own church, we'd go visit other churches to catch their revival meetings. And then there was camp meeting in the summer. And then there was indoor camp in the winter. I mean, it seemed like I was always at church. But you know what? That doesn't bother me now. I love being in God's house, and I love being with God's people. But I'll never forget, I was 8 years old, and we went to summer camp meeting. We met under a big army tent. I mean, a huge army tent. And I would remember as a little kid with the wind blowing on one of those nice summer thunderstorms that would come through, and it'd start shaking the tent. I'd be like, I don't want to die, because the tent would be blowing all over the place. But I'll never forget, we were sitting at our particular camp meeting. It was a large tent, and we were at the back of the tent meeting up on a little ridge that was right behind the tent. And I'll never forget the evangelist speaking. I have no idea what the evangelist said that night, but when it came for the invitation, I said to my mom, I got to go to the altar. And I gave my life to Jesus. That was the first time I counted the cost. Now, for an 8-year-old, a lot of times there's not too much to counting the cost, but I do remember as I grew up through my elementary and junior high years, I was teased mercilessly for following Jesus. This was back in the 70s, and I was teased mercilessly. Kids would come up and say, Dale, why do you got a smile on your face? There must be something wrong with you that you're happy all the time. I just loving Jesus. I'll never forget, our family left the little church there in Orfield, and we went to another church in Allentown where I spent a good part of my teen years and my young adult years till God finally moved us away. And I'll never forget, it was 1980. We went to one of the regional youth conventions. We also went to the major youth conventions, like what was now C3 and Set Apart. But we went to this one up in Toronto. And I'll never forget Dr. Jimmy Johnson, who was the leading youth pastor in the denomination. He was very unconventional at the time. He wore blue jean overalls to preach that morning. And he spoke about entering into full-time Christian service. That was 1980. And that morning I said, yes. I said, yes, Jesus, I am going to follow you into full-time Christian service. Now, I had no idea what that exactly meant, again. Because believe it or not, the very fact that I'm standing here talking to you this morning is God's grace. I can't even imagine when I was in, matter of fact, I still don't know how I did it. In 11th grade during speech class, during English, 11th grade English, everybody was supposed to give a speech. I don't ever remember giving a speech. And yet I didn't fail the class. So I don't know what happened there. But I would avoid, if there was volunteers to give speeches at school, I'd be like the last one. Do not make me get up in front of people. Something you're going to hear me say a couple times today. God does not call the qualified. God qualifies the called. And just to give you an idea of how introverted I was. It was about 1984, 1985. Pam's sister had been coming to our church, and she thought, hey, this would be a really good idea if we got Dale and Pam together. And they told me, they said, Dale, all you have to do is ask her on a date. She really wants to go out on a date with you. Matter of fact, the first time I met Pam, I ran out of the room because I was so introverted and shy. It's amazing that we got together after that. But our youth pastor actually got us together for our first date. Now, the rest is history. We fell in love and got married and all that great stuff. But like I said, the fact that I'm up here this morning is not because I feel I'm a great speaker. Matter of fact, I think Pam's a better preacher than I am. And I've been doing this for a lot longer than she has. But it was 1986, and I had lost my job at AT&T just because they were cutting back. It was part of a downturn in the economy. And so I went to this temporary job. It was work for a place called Daytimers, who makes like the Franklin planners, the day runners, to make something very similar to that. And we were to do inbound calls. We trained for 10 days. Day number 8, they sent us out to take our first live call, and I was sitting there like, I couldn't make my hand sit still because I was so nervous about taking this inbound call. Here's God's grace again. That was in September. By February, after the peak season, they said, Dale, would you like to stay on with us? That's pretty amazing. It's pretty amazing. I was good at what I did. I was quick and it didn't irritate the customers. And then that summer, I didn't accept that position because that summer I was going to tour with a group called the Continental Singers, and so I did. And God spoke to me more and more during that time. Dale, I want you to go into full-time Christian ministry. So after I got home, Pam and I got married, and I'll never forget the day. This is the way you know God is calling you. God spoke to Pam, myself, and our senior pastor. For those of you who went on the Hepzibah trip, Dan, who I introduced you to that day, all three of us at the same time, we got together and we started talking like, God's really calling you into the ministry. Because God spoke to all three of us that day. And so we started making the plans. Now, Pam and I were living the great American dream. I'll tell you about that in a second. I had a great job. And I'll never forget the day that we packed up everything we owned and put it in a yellow truck and moved from Allentown, Pennsylvania to the flatlands of Indiana and left everything we knew. Talk about counting the cost. Talk about picking up your cross. Jesus tells us that if we want to be a disciple of His, we must count the cost. These are tough words from Jesus, but following Jesus is a tough thing. Too many, I think, in our culture today, we say, all you have to do is all you have to do is turn your life over to Jesus and your life will become hunky-dory. No, my friends, that is not the way it works. If we follow Jesus, it's a tough thing. Let's take a look. Let's take a look at the scriptures this morning. Mark chapter 8, beginning at verse 31. Then Jesus began to tell them that the Son of Man must suffer many terrible things and be rejected by the elders and the leading priests and the teachers of the religious law. He would be killed, but 3 days later he would rise from the dead. As he talked about this openly with his disciples, Peter took him aside and began to reprimand him for saying such things. Jesus turned around and looked at his disciples and then reprimanded Peter. "Get away from me, Satan," he said. You are seeing things merely from a human point of view and not from God's. Then calling to the crowd to join his disciples, he says, "If any of you wants to be my follower, you must turn from your selfish ways, take up your cross, and follow me. If you try to hang on to your life, you will lose it. But if you give up your life for my sake," Jesus says, "and for the sake of the good news, you will save it. And what do you benefit if you gain the whole world but lose your soul? Is anything worth more than your soul?" Now, just to give you a little context of where this sits in the gospel narrative, verse 31 comes right after Peter's declaration that he said, Jesus was asking his disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" And Jesus says, "You are the Messiah, the Son of God." And Jesus says, "Well done." So then Jesus starts talking about that he was going to have to die. And Jesus says, "No." Peter's like, "No, you don't have to die." He starts to reprimand Jesus. Wait a second. Think about that. Peter is reprimanding Jesus. We're in trouble. He's like, "You don't have to go through this. You don't need to die. We're all here for you. We would lay down our life for you." And Jesus says, "Enough. Get away from me. You are seeing things from a human point of view, not from God's view." And isn't that the truth? So often we see things from our limited point of view. It's tough to see things from God's perspective because God's perspective is a kingdom view. It's not our view. We have an our kingdom view. God's kingdom is a kingdom of paradox. Jesus says if you hang on to your life, you will lose it. If you give away your life, you will find it. If you want to be first in the kingdom, you have to be last. If you're first, you're going to be last, and if you're last, you're going to be first. It doesn't make any sense. Jesus said, we're going to go to another passage of Scripture. It's almost in this same narrative, but it's found in a different book. It's found in Luke's Gospel, Luke chapter 9. We find that Jesus, and it comes right after the same discussion that Jesus said about picking up your cross and following me. Verse 57, as they were walking along, someone said to Jesus, "I will follow you wherever you go." But Jesus replied, "Foxes have dens to live in, and birds have nests, but the Son of Man has no place even to lay his head." Jesus was asking that person who came up and said, "I will follow you." Jesus was saying, can you give up the creature comforts to follow me? Verse 59, he said to another person, "Come follow me." The man agreed, but he said, "Lord, first let me return home and bury my father." But Jesus told him, "Let the spiritually dead bury their own dead. Your duty is to go and preach about the kingdom of God." So Jesus tries a second time. This person knew that they would have to give up family ties in order to follow Jesus. Verse 61. Another said, "Yes, Lord, I will follow you, but first let me say goodbye to my family." But Jesus told him, "Anyone who puts a hand to the plow and then looks back is not fit for the kingdom of God." Jesus knew this one's heart as well. He had divided loyalties. And for a while, I kind of couldn't understand where this particular passage was coming from. But it comes from 1 Kings 19 through 21. Let's go there. 1 Kings 19 through 21. So Elijah went and found Elisha, son of Shaphat, plowing a field. There were 12 teams of oxen in the field, and Elisha was plowing with the 12th team. Elijah went over to him and threw his cloak across his shoulders, then walked away. What Elijah was doing is saying, "Elisha, you are chosen by God to be my messenger." Elisha left the oxen standing there and ran after Elijah and said to him, "First, let me go and kiss my father and mother goodbye, and then I will go with you." Sound familiar? Elijah replied, "Go on back, but think about what I have done to you." He's just received the call of God on his life. So verse 21. So Elisha returned to his oxen, and he took them back to the barn, and then he put away his plow, and he went and kissed his mom and dad goodbye. No. He returned to his oxen and slaughtered them. There was no going back. He used the wood from the plow to build a fire to roast their flesh. He passed around all the meat to the townspeople, and they all ate. Then he went to with Elijah as his assistant. Elisha wanted to follow God, but Elijah had to remind him of his divided loyalties. Elijah reminded him of what the cloak meant. And Elisha changes his mind, destroys all the tools of his trade. So where are you this morning? Which of the three are you? Which one of these things is holding you back from following Jesus? Is it the thought of leaving creature comforts, keeping you from following Jesus? In many ways, the great American dream keeps many people, especially here in the States, from following Jesus the way he would like. Like I said, Pam and I were living the great American dream. I was working, by this time I was still working for Daytimers. I was working as a full-time employee. I was working in the information technologies department. I was doing computer hardware and software support for all the people who had PCs in our building. Not only that building, but a second building that we had across town. I was living the dream. I had what I needed. God was providing us. We had 2 darling little girls, and we were attending a great church where we were enjoying ministry. Matter of fact, right after we got married, probably about 6 months or so, Pastor Barry, B-E-R-R-Y, I would call him Pastor Dan now, but back then we called him Pastor Barry. And he said, "Dale, I want you to serve on the LBA." 24 years old, being asked to serve on the LBA. Our very first board meeting, we talked about building an extension onto the building. God doesn't call the qualified, God qualifies the called. I had no idea. They started talking about all these numbers. I'm like, I don't have a clue. So I just kind of sat back and listened. It's a good thing to do when you're in a place where you don't have a clue. So we're at this great church. We felt God's call on our life. And I'll never forget the day I went into my boss at Daytimers. I gave her a few months' notice. I probably gave her 3 or 4 months' notice. And I said, I feel God's calling us into full-time Christian ministry, and we're going to leave Allentown. We're going to move to Indiana, and I'm going to go to school. I don't have a job lined up there yet, but we're going to go to school. Are you nuts? You don't know everything there is to know about computers yet. You're good, but you don't know everything you need to know. You don't know anything about this networking thing. Matter of fact, networking was just starting to kind of come into the forefront. And she was right. I didn't know anything about this networking. I knew a little bit. People all over the building were like, Dale, are you nuts? Are you crazy? What are you moving to Indiana for? Well, God called me to go into the ministry. Why would you give up the great American dream? Why would you give up a house and 2 kids to move to a tiny house that we said we had central a vacuum system because we could plug our vacuum in the middle of the house and reach every room in the house. We moved into this tiny little house with 2 girls. And then I went go and look for a job. Found one. God was good. And God blessed us. My answer then and still is now, when God calls, you follow, even when you don't know where he's taking you. Those years in Indiana were lean years. I'll never forget getting home one night, and I said, Pam, what's for dinner? She goes, I don't know. It wasn't because she hadn't planned anything. It's because there was no food in the house. There was nothing. Amazingly, that afternoon, somebody dropped off a bag of groceries on the back step. That happened a lot. People would just they would knock on the door and then leave, and there would be this bag of groceries. We would go to church, and somebody would shake our hands, and when we pulled away, there would be a $20 bill in our hands. We didn't ask for any of that. We were just living a life of faith. I'll never forget our family nights in Marion. It's kind of fun. We had a place called Hills Department Store. I don't know if you had a Hills around here. But Hills had a little snack bar. And on Friday nights, you could go to Hills and ask for free kids' cups of popcorn. So they give you maybe two little cups of popcorn. And Pam and I would buy 2, what they call in Indiana, pops. We'd buy 2 fountain drinks. And we sit down there, and we just have family time, and then we'd go walk around the mall for a little bit. But my girls, when they talk about Indiana, that's where they grew up. They loved it there. They loved Indiana. It's amazing. I'll never forget, after I graduated, it took us 2 years till God called us to the next place. We stayed in Marion. We stayed in Marion 5 years. We finally got a position as worship pastor up in Flint, Michigan. And we were enjoying leading worship there. And about a year and a half into being at Flint First, God said, "You're done. I don't want you to lead worship. I want you to go be a pastor." What? You want me to preach? It was okay to talk a little bit while leading worship, but to preach a whole sermon? I didn't take those classes at Indiana Wesleyan. I took music classes. That's what I was trained for. And so I called my friend, a couple DSs that I knew, and I said, God's calling us into a pastoral ministry. I don't have any training. I took a couple flame classes, and I had a couple things under my belt. My friend, Pastor Dan, said, I got a church for you in upstate New York, not too far away from Albany. He goes, this church just needs to be loved on. So we went there, and I preached my very first sermon ever. And for some reason, those people must have had pity on us or something, or God was calling us, but they gave us a unanimous call to come be their pastor. I don't know how that happened. They endured some pretty poor preaching over those first couple years until I took the classes that I needed. God doesn't call the qualified. God qualifies the called. What are you willing? Are you willing to give up the creature comforts in order to follow Jesus? Secondly, the second person was asked to give up family ties. Family ties are very important. Pam grew up with 3 sisters and a brother, and she has so many nieces and nephews that sometimes we lose count. And her great nieces and nephews, it's tough to keep track of them all. My family was a little smaller, but family's important to us. Always has been. I can only imagine now that I'm a grandfather. We lived 10 minutes from my mom and dad in Allentown when God called us into the ministry. We lived 2 hours from Pam's mom and dad. I can't imagine what it was like for them. I couldn't imagine at the time to be 10 hours from their grandchildren. Yet now, because my daughter is following the call to the ministry, and we are following the call to the ministry, we are 10 hours away from our grandson. Last Sunday morning, while we were kind of not getting ready for church, Rebecca and Michael stayed for an extra day because I did not want them driving up 81 on Saturday. So they stayed here and they left Sunday morning, and we all had a good cry as we left and parted ways. Are family ties keeping you from following Jesus? Or maybe this last one, and you kind of see that they're all linked together, divided loyalties. Divided loyalties. I remember talking to a man several years ago who felt that the Lord was calling him into the ministry. You know what his answer for not following God's call to me was? He goes, I don't know that I can lose the golden handcuffs. He was working at a very prestigious company, had a great 401k, had a very great pension, had a great retirement plan, and all very vested in that. In order for him to enter the ministry, he'd have to give all that up. Was entering the ministry worth it to him? No. So the question this morning remains: are you willing to count the cost to follow Jesus? And I don't know what that means for you. For me, that meant entering into full-time Christian service to follow his call. For you, it might mean that God is calling you to enter full-time Christian service. Whether you're a youngster or whether you're 50 years old, God might be calling you into full-time Christian service. God might be calling you to be a missionary. What if God asked you to give all? What if God would ask you to leave your family? What if God asked you to sell your possessions and to follow him? What would you do? Many years ago, singer-songwriter Michael Card wrote a song that I'm going to share with you as we close today. The question is this: what would it take to keep you from Jesus? The words are going to be on the screen as I sing it this morning, and I just want you to sit and listen. The altar is going to be open if you feel that you need to respond this morning. It's open. I want you to listen. I want you to read the words. And I encourage you to follow his leading. And the reason I say this is this. We've been talking a lot about this morning, or about this the last couple weeks. Downpour, receiving a downpour. What's really interesting, it seems to me, as Pastor James has been talking to us about a downpour, It's really about being obedient to God. That the downpour will not come unless we are obedient to what God is calling us to. Yes, it's recognizing that He's a holy God. Yes, it's realizing our sin. Yes, it's repentance. It's also about obeying. And perhaps your obedience to God is what will release the downpour in your life. The streams of mercy, the showers of blessing, a true revival in your heart, a true downpour in the life